Hey, confirmation class. This is going to be the second half of the history section of our confirmation class. I don't know how long we're going to be not able to have church, so I want to be able to do this online, and this actually affords us some luxuries that we normally wouldn't have. So I'm going to continue from where we left off with the church in the West being in flux and having a lot of conflict and the authority of the church kind of being challenged. Well, the authority kind of came back, but a lot of people still viewed it as corrupt, right? So let me go to this next slide real quick. So this is a kind of diagram of different Christian denominations. These are more broadly speaking. So what we're going to be dealing with, so where the blue and the red lines divert from the gray line right here, that's the Great Schism that we talked about, right? Not the one with the multiple popes, but the one between Eastern and Western churches. So then, so we want to talk about, so we've already talked about that, but where I'm moving forward is we're going to move here where the green line comes out of the red line here, the Protestant Reformation, because we are Protestants. We are not Roman Catholics. We're not under that jurisdiction or that denominational umbrella. We don't report to the Pope. I will say personally, I've worked with Roman Catholics and other ministries and things like that, and it's perfectly fine. Church, and I even have I admire the Pope, but I don't think he's infallible, and I don't think that he has the ultimate authority over us as Christians. So that's my 2 cents. And but going forward, we need to talk about the Protestant Reformation. So actually, there's a great video from Crash Course that I'd like to pause the video right now, and I'd like you to go watch it. This is a long one. It's 15 minutes, but it does a really good job of covering the historical part of this. And then when you unpause it, we'll get into the history leading up to our church and to where we are now. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause. Okay, now that you're back, so let's move to the next situation. So, sorry about that line right there. So we're dealing with Protestant history. So there are these people here are very impactful for who we are as United Methodists today. John Hus was actually before the Protestant Reformation, and he had a lot of similar ideas that Martin Luther did, but he did it in the kingdom of Bohemia, which is current day the Czech Republic, or was formerly Czechoslovakia. And he was actually before Luther, but he had a lot of the beginning ideas of Protestantism, along with John Wycliffe in England. And John Hus was a little bit more successful than John Wycliffe. But anyway, so but he's important because out of Bohemia and out of people who were influenced by him, we get the Moravian Brotherhood, which comes to impact John Wesley very much later on. Martin Luther, which was discussed in the Crash Course video, is kind of the main guy in the Protestant Reformation. He is the guy getting it moving, and that's he is fundamental. And today we still incorporate a lot of the things that a lot of the thoughts that Martin Luther had. Then we have John Calvin, who kind of comes a little bit after Martin Luther. So the reason why I want to bring him up is because you can't have a discussion about Protestantism without talking about John Calvin, and we've talked about him before, and talked about how in the United Methodist Church we don't really follow Calvin. So it's important to know his place in history and how he was right around that same time that Martin Luther was, also doing his reforms. But then the next part, this one's really important for us, is the Church of England separating from the Roman Catholic Church by Henry VIII. Officially, no, here's a misnomer. Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church. The Church of England did not become fully Protestant until about Elizabeth I. So it's a misnomer, but that is when the division happened. So I just want to keep that in mind, that Henry VIII is important because the Church of England separates from the Catholic Church because of him, and John Wesley would later become a priest within the Church of England. So that's very important. Now then we have Jacob Arminius, who is a Dutch theologian who the Holland or the Netherlands became a very big hotspot for Calvinist theology, and Jacob Arminius was coming out with theology to counter John Calvin's influence there. And so today, we United Methodists theologically kind of fit within that camp. And there's a lot of other denominations that fit within Jacob Arminius' theology, but John Wesley was greatly impacted on his thoughts, especially the thoughts of free will. So let's keep going forward. So here is a good breakdown of Protestant denominations. So we have Lutherans on the bottom, we have Pietists here. Now these are very important because out of we actually are influenced by Pietism here in the Methodist Church. I'm surprised they don't have a connecting, or at least even a dotted line there. Then we have the Anglican Church. We have Puritans and Quakers, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and I talked about these are our Arminians, are people influenced by that. We have Calvinism, which we've talked about before, and we have Reformed churches, which is it's Calvinism. It's just it's a different form of Calvinism, but they are very similar to Presbyterians here. And then we have Baptist, which we have across the street, of course, and we have Anabaptist, who are actually Amish, Mennonites, those kind of people, right? And if you can see here, we have the Puritans, and then we have Methodists come out of Anglicanism. So we're going to talk about that, and then, but if you look, we influenced the holiness movement. So holiness movement people would be like Church of the Nazarene, and there's a few other holiness denominations out there. Then we have the Seventh-day Adventists actually came out of Methodism, and we also have Pentecostalism who came out of the holiness movement. So that's a interesting route there. So anyway, so that's kind of a broad overview of how denominations, Protestant Christian denominations came about. So we have the Church of England, which is very important because the Church of England, England being a really contentious place, there was a lot of people who wanted to stay loyal to Catholicism. There were a lot of people who were advocating for radical reform. So these are the things that they implemented. So they implemented in the reign of Elizabeth the Via Media, which is Latin for the middle way. The Church of England saw themselves as something between Roman Catholics and between the reforms of John Calvin. So that's an interesting, but that's something that we kind of inherited as United Methodist, is that this idea of a middle way between the liturgical tradition of the Roman Catholic Church, which we still retain a lot in our communion liturgy and things like that. But then we have the Reformed, we have some Reformed aspects of kind of emphasizing that we are saved through grace alone, de-emphasizing the sacraments, but we're still sacramental. We're just not as heavily reliant on them as Catholics are. Then we have the Book of Common Prayer, which came out right around the same time as the Elizabeth during the reign of Elizabeth I. This also was written in Shakespearean English at the time. It's been updated over the years, and it's still in use today. But this created a common liturgy for the entire church, that every Anglican church uses these. And then we have the 39 Articles, which I presented. Some of those made those into our doctrine, but John Wesley edited those himself. So it's a little different. But then we inherited also episcopal polity, meaning that we have bishops, just like the Church of England has bishops. We also inherited a lot of our theological understanding of the sacraments from the Church of England, because all of these things come together in the fact that John Wesley was a priest within the Church of England. So we have to keep that in mind. So going forward. So John Wesley's family, sorry about that. John Wesley's family, his father was an Anglican priest, Samuel Wesley. His mother, Susanna Wesley, daughter of a Puritan and nonconformist pastor. So, and then his father's on the top, his mother's to the right, and then John Wesley's here in the corner, and then next to him is his brother Charles. Charles Wesley wrote a lot of the famous hymns that we sing still today. For instance, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" is one of the great Charles Wesley hymns. So the way I like to look at it is John Wesley was the brains. Charles, not saying that he wasn't smart or anything, but that he was about the music. He was a music lover, and he wrote great hymns that spoke to common people, which is it's led to a lot of growth within the Methodist Church. So early in life, he was educated at Oxford, became an Anglican priest after studying at Oxford, had a hard time finding a parish. He worked for his dad until his dad passed away, sadly. But then his brother went to Oxford as well, and he was like, "Hey, can you come and be a campus minister, ostensibly?" So he started this thing called the Holiness Club. That's actually where the term Methodist came from, is that they lived their life methodically. And so they were ridiculed and they were called Methodists, but the group actually took it on as their own. And so Charles Wesley was a part of this, but George Whitefield was also a part of this. George Whitefield was a famous evangelist and preacher who later on would preach throughout North America and England. So, but then after that, John Wesley had his journey to Savannah, Georgia. He wanted to do a couple of things. He wanted to help set up a new church parish there. He also wanted to minister to the Native Americans, as you can see in this picture here. Didn't have a lot of success with the ministering to the Native Americans, but we'll get into that. And then he ran into the Moravians on the ship to Georgia. They were thinking there was a storm on the way from England to Georgia, and he was very nervous that he was going to die, and he was just very freaked out. But nonetheless, the Moravians in the bow of the ship, or in the belly of the ship, were singing hymns and being joyful and saying that it doesn't matter what happens, but if we live, we get to keep praising God. If we die, we get to be with God. And it really showed John Wesley a more how faith could be. It demonstrated that. And the Moravians actually had more success ministering to Native Americans than John Wesley did. And so he started being the parish priest there in Savannah, Georgia, and he fell in love with a woman named Sophia Hopke, and she kind of rebuked him and ended up being engaged to another person. And John Wesley was not too happy about that, and he actually denied her communion. And it led to a very big outrage in the community, and he ended up having to flee Georgia in the middle of the night. And he kind of went, sorry about that again. He kind of went from Georgia back to England kind of defeated, not kind of knowing where he was. And when he got back, he really couldn't find a job in a parish again, and he was going through a lot of hard times. but that, and he was one of his friends who was um, a Moravian, Peter Boehmer. Boehmer. I can never remember how to pronounce his name. But he invited him, and he told him, like, and John Wesley said he had problems with faith, and he didn't know if he could keep preaching anymore. And then Peter told him, I said, well, preach faith until you have faith. And John Wesley kept preaching and preaching, and then it was May 24th, 1738, and he thought, and he was invited to this Bible study. He really didn't want to go, and we've all been there. We, don't want to go to something. And he ended up going, and they were reading Martin Luther's commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. And it was at this time in which he felt that his heart was strangely warmed. And this is a moment that transformed him, and it made him an evangelist. It made him who he is. And we are people who are inheritors of that heart strangely warmed. We are inheritors of that spirit-filledness that John Wesley felt that night. So, just this is a very important moment, not only for John Wesley, but for all of us who seek that moment, hopefully. All right, on to my next one. So, early Methodism. So, George Whitefield, part of the Holiness Club, and he did open air preaching. John Wesley formed Methodist societies. They weren't called churches. He had lay preachers, and so early societies, because they would have societal meetings at night, but he encouraged them to still participate in the Church of England parish that they lived in. He did not want to separate from the Church of England, but John Wesley was still having a hard time finding a parish and things like that. But then George Whitefield, who was doing this open air preaching, convinced him to do it. So he started preaching everywhere he could. And this story is actually he was forbidden to preach at the church where his father was buried in the churchyard. And so instead of preaching in the church, he actually stood on his father's grave and preached, because they could not tell him to leave his father's grave. So this just shows you the kind of perseverance that John Wesley had. And he also, when he couldn't get, since he wasn't working in a parish, he went to he went to mines, he went to fields where farmers were working and farmhands. He went out everywhere preaching to anybody who would listen to him. And these people formed the earliest Methodist societies. But it also led to persecutions. There was early Methodist meeting halls that didn't have windows on the bottom floor because mobs would break them in. So for John Wesley shaking up the church, because he really just wanted to reform the church. He didn't want to break away. He didn't want to create a new denomination. He was persecuted, and the early Methodist followers were persecuted as well. And so that's part of our history. Later Methodism, as John Wesley got older, he started organizing the church in England. He started creating chapels, circuits where traveling preachers would attend to the circuits. They would have quarterly meetings and annual conferences, which is a tradition that we still keep today. So then we have, then John Wesley passed away in 1791. And the Methodist movement stayed part of the Church of England for a little while, only about 6 years, as you can see, and they eventually separated. But we're gonna actually move on, because the Methodist Church in England isn't tied to us, United Methodists, because our history is here in the United States, and our history begins with the American Revolution, surprisingly enough. So when the Church of England, when the American Revolution happened, the King of England, who is the head of the Church of England, disestablished all the churches in the American colonies and recalled all the clergy. So all of these people were left with no sacraments. So no baptisms, no communion. Nobody was being taken care of pastorally, and it fell on lay preachers and other denominations and other traditions. But Methodists at the time had not created a separate church yet. So it was, even us Methodists were left out in the cold of not being able to attend on the sacraments. And so this led to a very real dilemma for John Wesley, who had come to America multiple times spreading the gospel, and there was Methodists all across the 13 colonies. So he ordained Thomas Coke as a superintendent. Now, John Wesley was not a bishop, and he really didn't have the authority to do this, but John Wesley actually wrote the Bishop of London multiple times saying, you need to send ordained people, we need to ordain a bishop so that people in the colonies can have these sacraments, and he wouldn't, the Bishop of London wouldn't. So it forced John Wesley to do this himself. So Thomas Coke was English, but he was ordained in 1784. He would later he'd be later considered a bishop within the Methodist Church in America. So, but when he arrived, it was the Christmas conference in Baltimore. This is where the Methodist Church started. So Francis Asbury was a lay preacher here in the United States. He actually had to hide multiple times during the war because of different things going on. But he was, it's actually really funny, he was ordained a deacon on Christmas Eve. He was ordained an elder Christmas Day, and he was ordained a bishop the day after Christmas. So it escalated very quickly for him. But Francis Asbury was so we had, and Thomas Coke was considered a bishop at this point. Francis Asbury was ordained a bishop, and Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury were the two first bishops of the newly created Methodist Episcopal Church. So that is the beginning of our church here in the United States, here in Baltimore, Maryland, 1784. And this is where it began for us in America. Don't get me wrong, it begins with John Wesley, but here is the focal point of our creation here, which makes it really interesting because we were actually the Methodist Church in America is actually older than the Methodist Church in England when you consider when they separated. But we have another group that came out of Germany, and so this is the history of the Evangelical United Brethren. So the United Brethren in Christ in 1800 were founded by Martin Blumer and Philip Oberman. And so, but then there was another group called the Evangelical Association formed right around the same time by Reverend Jacob Albright. These men were the founders of these two denominations would form together to form the Evangelical United Brethren Church in 1946. Now, these people were more German. They had some Moravian ties, but they had that pietism, holiness kind of connection, and they were very close to Methodist. And a lot of these people knew Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, and there was even talk that they might have formed a church together, but it didn't work out that way because of how it worked. But this is very important because for later on, so we'll go into this a little bit more. But this is where this denomination started. So we don't want to forget about the heritage of our Evangelical United Brethren. So let's keep moving on, but I'll come back to them. So the 1700s was kind of when we formed. The 1800s, so sadly, was when we had a lot of splits within the Methodist movement. So we have the African Methodist Episcopal Church separated in 1816, sadly because of racism. So sadly, This was a separation of because African Americans, both freed and slave, were not treated as equals within the Methodist Episcopal Church. So they left to form their own church. Now, this church still exists today and is still doing quite strongly. And they actually an AME church that's how we abbreviate it, was involved at the shooting in Charleston. Those were our Methodist brothers and sisters. Then you have the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Zion Church. They stayed around a little bit longer in the Methodist Episcopal Church to try to change it, but it ultimately didn't work out, and so they're kind of the second wave of that exodus out of for that reason. Then we have the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which a lot of churches around here were founded as, and that's a tough part of our history because of we split over slavery, and the Methodist Episcopal Church South didn't want to disown slave-owning bishops. Sadly, this is a very sad part of our history. A little, about a little under a decade later, Congregational Methodist Church started, and then this group split because they didn't like bishops, and they wanted to have each congregation have its own autonomy. That's a big part of, and they still exist today. They never came back together with us. And then we have the Free Methodist Church, which still is around today. They're kind of close to Congregationalists, but they had other issues that were going on, and they still exist today, and they're a very interesting group. Then you have the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, separated in 1870. Now this group is actually they were actually called Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, which is not a good name, and I'm only saying that for historical purposes. They are called Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and I have friends who are ministers within this denomination and things like that. And they separated because after the Civil War, the Methodist Episcopal Church South didn't want freed African Americans within their church. Another sad part of our history of racism, and so I just to own up to that. I don't want to cover over anything. I don't want to gloss over anything. I want to give you the truth. But I'll also sit here and say that Methodism grew exponentially within this time frame. We had right around the end of the American Revolution, we had about under 100,000 United Methodists within the United States. By the time of the Civil War, we had over 1 million, and the population of the United States wasn't that large, so it was exponential growth. And so, yeah, it's a lot. It's a very and so we grew so much, and we grew because of these camp meetings, because of this frontier spirit that we had, and the church here in Caddo Mills was founded by that same spirit. So just to kind of give you a glimpse into that. But yeah, sadly, the 1800s was really the century of Methodist splittings. But the 20th century was really the century of mergers, so that's something to really think about. We had the first merger in 1939, which was the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, along with the Protestant Methodist Church, came together to form the Methodist Church. And so that happened then. And then in 1968, the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church came together to form the United Methodist Church that we know today. And this conference actually happened in Dallas, Texas. So that's really, and our district superintendent and his wife were actually present at this conference. I also knew a person who was a minister at the time, who is still ministering today, who was also at that conference when he was in seminary. And so, yeah, this is the good thing about the all the divisions that we saw in the previous section, and this basically came back together. So, and that's why I wanted to lift up the Evangelical United Brethren history earlier, because it's a history that we often overlook. We kind of gloss over it, but they contribute so much to our tradition and to a lot of who we are as the United Methodist Church. And I think that's important to lift up and to make sure that we don't forget our heritage. And that's where we are today. And that's our history as United Methodist, going back all the way to the Protestant Reformation and the Church of England and the life of John Wesley. So, if you have any questions, please, don't hesitate and come back to me. And this soon will be over, or we'll soon be able to at least meet face to face. And I just want to encourage you to read on your own and to investigate and to learn as much as you can. And if you have any more questions, please come and talk to me. So this will do it for our history section of our confirmation class. See you soon.